couple of years ago, when I would tell people that I was planning on taking a gap year from college, most people disapproved. They would say things like, "You better be careful with that. You don't want to lose sight of your future." The fun part came next when I would tell them that I was going to spend that gap year riding my bicycle to South America. These responses were more diverse. I think my friend's mom put into words what everybody else was thinking, though. She grabbed me by the collar of my shirt, and she got in my face, and she yelled, "Are you effing crazy?" I'm not crazy. I just have questions. Basic questions, really. As a junior in college, I understood that my reality is enclosed within the people and the culture that I've grown up surrounded by. I wanted to experience different people, different ways of living, different ways of thinking about the world to get a clearer view of my own life and how I was going to live it. Questions like this aren't very easily squeezed into a scantron bubble and labeled true or false. Questions like this are answered through lived interaction and hands-on discovery. So I was wanting to get real, and what better way to get real than from the back of a bicycle? So I sold my car, bought a bicycle, recruited my brother and my best friend, and we started pedaling south. Now, I'm not a bicycle fanatic. I don't own a single pair of spandex, and I couldn't even change a flat tire until about the week before I left. But I like the way that a bicycle lets you get off the beaten track, and the way that it seems to break down barriers between strangers. So we said our goodbyes, and we pedaled out of my family's driveway in Kansas. Now, we were living on about $2 a day. That's because we camped. We camped on the side of the road. We camped in fields. We camped in forests. We camped under bridges. Sometimes in the suburbs, people got a little suspicious looking out the windows at us. But we were cooking our own food as well. We ate a lot of rice, a lot of beans, lentils with onion thrown in for some flavor. And we would clean ourselves in rivers and ponds and lakes and streams. And so we carried on this way for about 1,000 miles through the United States. And we really got into the backcountry of Oklahoma and Texas. And what we found is that there are some very interesting people in the backcountry of Oklahoma and Texas. And a lot of the time, the scariest people, like our friend Chuck here, actually were some of the most helpful people. My bike was broken down in a tiny little Oklahoma town of like 300 people, and Chuck came rumbling up in his truck and threw my bike in the back and actually welded the frame of my bicycle back together for me. Then had his wife make us pancakes, and he tried having us drink moonshine with him, but we kept going at that point. So we kept going. We went down through Dallas, Waco, San Antonio, and into the deserts of South Texas. And in the deserts of South Texas, it got hot, like 100 degrees hot. And by this point, we were bicycling about 100 miles a day with fully loaded bicycles of about 100 pounds. And it felt like another world. There were tarantulas scurrying across the shimmering highway, rattlesnakes sunning themselves on rocks. And it felt like our thoughts were evaporating under the sun and just bouncing around inside of our heads. But the closer we got to Mexico, as we got closer, the air just got thick with fear. As we got closer, people just started graphically describing the murders and monstrosities being carried out by the Mexican drug cartels on the other side of the border. And most people told us that we were going to get killed. And they wouldn't just say that we were going to get killed, they would go into detail, like that we would be decapitated. I don't even like saying things like this, but I just want you to understand just the swamp of fear we were wading through as we got to Mexico. It was terrifying. The decision to cross the border wasn't made out of bravery or foolishness. It was made by the belief that a world worth living in is a world in which people are good. We staked our lives on this, and we trusted this over everything. But we were still pretty scared our first night camping in Mexico. We were on an abandoned white sand beach in a little palm roof shelter, and we were running low on water, so we were rationing what we cooked and what we drank. And we were just waiting for the cartels to hear that there were a couple of Americans camping on the beach. So you can imagine that our hearts just stopped when we saw a dust cloud approaching us from the dirt road. A rusty old truck came rumbling out of a coconut grove, coming straight towards us, and in the bed of the truck was just full of people. And it came right up to us and pulled to a stop, and a Mexican man jumped out of the back with a machete. Then his grandmother got out of the front, and then all his kids and his wife got out of the back, and they pulled a bunch of coconuts out of the bed of the truck, and they carried them over to us, and the man started chopping them open with his machete, and they filled our water bottles with coconut water. And then the woman came over with spices and limes and salsa, and they carved out the insides of the coconuts and put it all together into a huge meal for us. And we feasted with this Mexican family on our first night in Mexico as they welcomed us to their country. And at this point, I was starting to understand something that would be continuously confirmed for me as I traveled throughout Latin America. In places where the world tells you that you'll be killed by cartels, you're more likely to be gifted coconuts. So the next day, we set off into Mexico. My friend Vasily, he headed home at this point. He's a philosopher with a knack for business, and he had better things to do back home. But my brother and I, we kept going. So we were learning a new survival routine in Mexico. We'd bicycle in the cool parts of the morning. Then we'd hitchhike in the unbearably humid parts of the afternoon. Then we'd bike some more in the early evenings before finding a campsite outside of a small town where we'd spend the night. We'd spend the night swimming in the ocean, sampling the local food, listening to salsa music. It was really nice. We carried on this way south down to the state of Michoacan, where we took a bus to avoid some more dangerous areas. And from there, we went inland through the mountains of Guerrero, the deserts of Puebla, and into the state of Oaxaca. And in northern Oaxaca, the desert breaks like a wave against a ridge of mountains, spilling into a lush, deciduous cloud forest on the other side, where the Mazatec population lives. And we spent several weeks there as our bodies, or as the Mexican food and water finally caught up to us. So we recovered in these mountains, and then we carried on south again, down into the state of Chiapas, the southernmost state. It's just full of deep valleys and thick pine forests, extremely beautiful. And at this point, my brother and I, we parted ways, and I carried on into Guatemala. Now, about 50 miles from the border of Guatemala, a Mexican man stopped me, and he told me, "You're going to get killed in Guatemala." By this point, I just laughed. I was so tired of hearing that I was going to die, so I just kept going. But Guatemala was hard. The roads were steep. It was the peak of the rainy season, and food was pretty hard to come by. I ate 9 bananas for lunch one day. And I just remember one morning in particular, I woke up in a grove of trees a couple hundred yards up from the road, camped out. And I just remember just feeling my isolation like a hole in my stomach. I just felt how far I was from everything familiar, from comfort, from friends, from everything. I felt like an astronaut just free-floating through space. But several days after that, I met a Mayan family, and they took me in and started treating me like a part of their family. And that hole started being filled. I would sit on the roof with the children, teaching them phrases of English, but these lessons would always just turn into games. I'd go out in the fields helping them with their corn and their beans, and then I'd sit in the kitchen chatting with the women late into the night as they made tortillas. And I'd accompany my good friend Chalo as he'd visit different schools in the communities around the countryside, teaching the children their local dialect of Cachiquel. So it was an excellent month that I spent with him. It was one of the poorest places that I've ever been, but it was also one of the happiest. And as the time came for me to leave, my Mayan friends decided to conduct a traditional Mayan religious ceremony on the day of my departure. They were conducting this ceremony on the day of Taj, the day of Mayan cosmology that's said to be imbued with the power of understanding. And I found it really touching that they weren't sending me on my way with luck or health or safety, but what they found to be most important was that they sent me on my way with understanding. So on the day of the ceremony, they assembled bricks, the 20 bricks in the center, each one represents a different day of Mayan cosmology, and they assembled these bricks so that they pointed in 4 directions, the cardinal directions, and they believe that the ancestral energy flows strongest along these points. At the end of each point, they would put a different symbol for the earth, air, fire, and water. Now, in order to understand this ceremony, there is a fire at the center of the bricks. And to understand this ceremony, you have to understand that this was all representative of a broader view. They didn't believe the fire is a symbol of the self and the soul and the spirit. And the bricks, it's not just a pile of bricks with ancestral energy flowing around it. It's a symbol of us and the energy flowing around us at all times. So to understand the ceremony, you have to understand this, because when the Mayan would place his fingers on you, he wasn't just touching you. He was opening an avenue for the ancestral energy of understanding to actually fill you with understanding. Now, whether or not you believe in ancestral energy or the supernatural or whatever, this was a very powerful ceremony. And what I found to be particularly important during this ceremony was that the Mayans were sprinkling corn, maize, into the fire, into the soul, into the self. These weren't corporate seeds, these weren't Terminator seeds, these were seeds that had been harvested and saved and passed from generation to generation, continuing an integral part of the Mayan self and identity that is their connection to their land and their crops. Now, after the ceremony, the Mayans held a community meeting in which they discussed how they were going to fight legislation that was attempting to bring Terminator seeds from foreign corporations into Guatemala. I realized that for them, this wasn't about hippie Whole Foods or the latest non-GMO diet trend. This was religious. This was survival. Their religion, their language, and their way of life was under threat. Now, it's one thing to hear that the world is interconnected. It's another thing to stand around a fire with a group of Mayans as they contemplate how their way of life will survive the drastic changes being brought about largely by entities from my own home country. So we'll fast forward a little bit. I carried on south into El Salvador, where I was detained briefly. I had my life saved by a group of socialists in Nicaragua and actually spent a night in a socialist hospital. And then down into Panama, where a good friend of mine hiked into the Panamanian jungle with me, where we spent time with the indigenous Nobe group. And then into Colombia, where I was adopted by a Mayan shepherd family. Or not a Mayan shepherd family, a shepherd family in the northern Colombian Andes. Now, I haven't answered all of my questions, and I hope that I never do. But as I've refined my questions and they've evolved, my journey has taken different forms. So also throughout my gap year, I spent time in the inner city at an urban farm looking at how the urban farm was affecting local crime rates. Then I also spent time in the northern highland deserts of New Mexico, looking at how Native Americans are dealing with similar challenges to those that the Mayans are dealing with. And most recently, my journeys led me to the top floor of a skyscraper in Chicago, where I was offered one of the most prestigious academic awards in the world to continue pursuing my questions at some of the top universities in England. So obviously, questions have played a very important role in my life, but I feel like in the modern world, questions often don't even have space to be born. I remember when I was younger in elementary school with Middle-earth, Robinson Crusoe, and Treasure Island floating through my head. I remember just how my heart sank when I was told that the world that I live in has already been explored. And I'm thankful that I realized that that's not true. There is a difference between living in a world that has been mapped and living in a world that has been explored. The world that we live in retains a beautiful diversity of people, places, and cultures with infinite complexities and ageless traditions. Until you have stood in a place and smelled the spices and wiped the dust of that place off of your face, it has not been explored. And in order for our children and our grandchildren to be able to enjoy the same freedom to explore, it will require not just a respect, but a love for all forms of diversity, not just biological diversity, but cultural diversity as well. It will require us as individuals and as societies to reach a level of understanding to overcome economic and spiritual incentives to make other people exactly like us. Because if you don't explore, whether it's the rainforest, that scary church on the other side of town, or your own backyard, you won't really question. And all it takes is one real question to tip you into places that you can't even imagine. And these places don't have to be dangerous. They become dangerous when we lose that sense of humanity that comes with real human connection. They become dangerous when we allow ourselves to believe that the violence and hate that fills the news is the human norm. It becomes dangerous when we become so suspicious and scared of one another and of difference that we cut ourselves off from one another. That's when the world becomes dangerous. If you open yourself to the world, I think you'll find that the world will receive you happily. So explore, open yourself to questions, and get real. Thank you.